The ways by which chess openings acquire their names are many and varied. Some of them are named after towns, some after countries, some even after culinary dishes. The one we're going to be looking at here is actually named after a Brazilian master born in the 19th century who rejoiced in the name of Octavio Siqueiro Trompovsky de Almeida. And if I said that wrong, my apologies to him. In more modern times, it's acquired the following of very strong players like Korchnoi, who used it twice to defeat Karpov, Vaganyan, Gurevich, Pickett, Adams, and the twice British champion Julian Hodgson. In particular, Hodgson has made it into a fearsome tournament weapon.
In this survey, I'm going to look at a variety of responses for black, starting off with those where he allows white the option, should white wish to take it, of taking on f6 and doubling his pawns. So the first thing we should be looking at is 2d6, and then 2g6, and then 2c5, and 2d5. All of those moves allow white the option of taking on f6 and doubling the pawns. Next, we'll move on to the two primary methods by which black stops his pawns being doubled, which are either 2e6, preparing the recapture with the queen, or removing the knight from the possibility of capture altogether with 2 knight e4. Perhaps the most popular reply to the Trompovsky. After 2d6, if white does not now immediately capture on f6 but defers by playing, for example, knight d2, then he'll be denied the opportunity permanently because black can reply with, for example, knight d7, and after e4 reach a comfortable game with either g6 or e5. Following the capture on f6, black normally takes back with the g-pawn. Taking back with the e-pawn would steer play towards formations we should be looking at after the move 2g6 for black. So here it's mainly taking with the g-pawn we're looking at. Now, black is going to argue he has a bishop pair and a central pawn cluster majority. White's going to argue he can get a better pawn structure. Therefore, the move 3e3 fits more into his scheme of things than the advance e2 to e4, after which black would find it easier to undouble his pawns by playing f6 to f5, which also increases scope for his bishops. There's not a lot of actual practice on this position. For example, black might try the formation of f6 to f5, d6 to d5, e7 to e6, and try and hold the centre like that. Or, to return to the position, he might strike with c5. Or he might play d5 and c5. Indeed, almost any permutation you care to suggest is a viable play here. Bishop g7 into fianchetto. Not a bad one either. One of the leading exponents of the Trompovsky in Europe is Grandmaster Julian Hodgson. When winning the British Championship in 1991, he played almost nothing but the Trompovsky with white, securing a 100% record with it. In round one, his opponent Salim played b6 here. Hodgson borrowed an idea from the last century, fianchetting his bishop by playing it to e2 and then f3. Salim played queen c8, and the opening moves of this game give a good idea of how to try for an advantage with white. Knight d2, rook g8. Hodgson is trying to just keep the structure very strong and very clear, not mixing it too much at an early stage. Knight c6, knight e2, e5. So black commits himself to what he's doing with his central pawns. Probably unwisely. It may not look too obvious at the moment, but the f-pawns are now rather easier to get at, and Hodgson exploits this weakness very adroitly. c3, queen d7, queen c2, first threat, f5, castles. Black also castled. Bishop to g2. King b8, after which black now threatens to take on d4 with his knight. So Hodgson avoided that trick, and now the knights are moving towards these weak f-pawns, f6, knight h4. Very simple, very powerful strategy. Knight to e7, but now the bishops were exchanged. and f4. We can leave the discussion of this game here. The black bishop on f8 is really dead wood, and the white knights are really in their element and exploiting the weaknesses in black's game. If now, for example, e4, the white could just play d5, silencing the bishop and the subsequent knight d4 into e6 to follow with a strategically winning position. And Hodgson, in fact, did go on to win this game. The attempt to fianchetto the king-bishop immediately with g6 is a perfectly well-motivated move. Now, the only consistent Trompovsky move here is to capture on f6. Moves like knight f3 or knight d2 take us back into quieter lines of the Torre attack. But we are tromp players, so we lop it off. Only one recapture. And already a fundamental dichotomy. To play e3 now with white, or to play c4. Well, the big distinction is if you don't play c4 immediately, then you allow black the option of planting a pawn at d5. Look at a few games, a few ideas, a few themes, and you'll see the relevance of this parting of the ways. After e3, bishop g7, putting the knight on f4 makes a lot of sense here. Knight e2, to tee that up. Here's an example of just how devastating the Trompovsky can be against an unsuspecting black player. b6 is a well-motivated fianchetto move. Knight hops out to f4. And now d5, trying to get more grip on the centre. That is a very noteworthy move indeed, h4. Very, very often deployed by white to try to soften up the black king side. Indeed, so much of an irritation did the advance of the pawn to h5 when either a capture on g6 or the irritant move h6 is always in the air, that the player of the black pieces, in this instance George Botterill, twice British champion, preferred to halt it with h5. This is a game with Raphael Vagagnan from the Hastings tournament of 1974. c4, another very natural lever in this position. If now black tries to bolster the pawn with c6, he's going to end up in considerable structural trouble after c takes d5, c takes d5, an immutable isolated d-pawn there, queen b3 for example, bishop to e6 to protect it, bishop b5 check, and there are lots of tactical and structural problems in black's game. That's why he preferred to take on c4, but after the recapture bishop takes c4. This bishop's already on a very nice diagonal. What black cannot castle now, because of the reply. Knight takes g6, exploiting the pin. So he preferred the other fianchetto, bishop b7. Knight c3. Probably best here now is something like queen e7 or knight c6, trying to set up a castling queenside. In fact, the oblivious player of the black pieces played bishop h6. And it didn't last much longer after the thunderbolt bishop takes f7 check. King takes queen to b3 check, when the black king can't go to g7 or f8 because of the fork of the queen. So Botterill tried to survive with king e8, but after knight takes g6, his position is really already resignable, because if rook h7, then queen to g8 check picks it up. He in fact tried to hang on with queen to d7, but Vagagnan ended the game very quickly. Knight takes rook, queen g7, queen check, king f8, knight d5, knight d7, and the elegant move knight e7, after which black gave up. There's a terrifying example of how quickly the attack can break out with this weakening move h4 to soften up the black king side. For e3, bishop g7, knight e2, d5, knight f4, castles. All very placid up until now, it seems, but now the same plan of shoving the h-pawn into the fray. In view of its arrival on the black king side, the move knight c6 is intended to put the knight on e7, where it's going to have something to do with the defence. h5, on we go. knight e7, h takes g6. Personally, I would have preferred to have delayed that exchange. I'd have played, I think, c4 there. Black takes back towards the centre, and his king looks pretty well defended because white has no dart-squared bishop to attack it with. Does have a light-squared bishop though. After c4, d takes c4, bishop takes. It's going to have its say in affairs. Bishop f5, knight c3. So how is black to proceed from here? Well, Lev Albert, the ex-Soviet player, is now an ex-US champion. He had this position in 1979 as white versus Joel Benjamin. Benjamin played c5, hoping to get some counterplay in the centre. But after e4, his position was already critical. He should really retreat with his bishop now, ceding white a clear superiority. He in fact took on d4, and after e takes f5, was unable really to capture on c3 because of the simple reply f takes g6, after which the black king side is completely destroyed. As a consequence here, at move 15, black is already lost. This then is another clear example of how dangerous this plan with h4 can be for black. Joel Benjamin is by no means a weak player, and he was really blown away here. This position arose in the key game for the 1991 English Chess Championships, the playoff match between Michael Adams and Nigel Short. And Short obviously has faith in the move 2g6, played it in this key game, and after 4h4, immediately, Adams didn't hang around, Short adopted a setup which appears very robust and very sensible. Black just awaits developments while keeping his positional trumps of central control and the two bishops. He played f5, and after h5, bishop g7. So for the time being, this bishop is, so to speak, biting on granite. But the setup Short came up with, I think, is very noteworthy. e3, d6, not d5. Bishop c4, knight d7, knight e2, and you put the knight on b6. Bishop back to b3, bishop d7. Black just wants to get developed, put the queen on the e-file, hold the centre, and see what happens. Well, Adams, having put his bishop on b3, was reluctant to play the move c2 to c4, so he developed his knight to c3. Queen e7, played short, and up went the other rook pawn to a4. Well, this advance Short did wish to hold. Doesn't want his knight from a b6 to be kicked away, so a5 to hold up matters on that side of the board. Knight f4, and there comes another solid entrenching move, c6. Black slowly staking out his ground. Queen d2, played Adams, and here comes an interesting waiting move, bishop f6. Now if you've advanced your h-pawn to h5, you're often reluctant to castle kingside. This is the case here. Adams had no desire to see the lines opened up against this king if he went short, so he went long, castles queenside. And Short completed his strategy with d5, blocking the centre. Well, this game is far from over. White could, and probably should, build up in the centre now with something like rook to e1, f3. But when that happens, of course, the black bishops are likely to become more active. In fact, Adams chose the extremely speculative move g4. And after f takes g4, he advanced e4, leading to great complications. And Short eventually won in a very unclear struggle. But I think the defensive formation he adopted here is a very noteworthy one and a good one against the early advance of the h-pawn. Although the systems involving the early advance of the h-pawn are quite viable and can be a lot of fun for white, my personal preference would be for a more strategical approach. So for here, for example, the plan of advancing the c-pawn, putting the knight behind it, and then the fianchetto of the white bishop, and putting the knight on e2 like this. Very, very tough formation indeed. Obviously black is going to have a hard time making any impression upon it, and the natural plan of advancing pawns on the queen side to support the bishop in fianchetto, as you often see, for example, in an English defence, suggests itself here. Here's a good example of how to use this plan. c4, f5, knight c3, bishop g7, g3, d6, bishop g2, knight d7, e3, knight f6, knight e2. One other benefit of this plan is it's easy to memorize, so you can play a lot of your moves very quickly in the opening. Black castled, and the move b4. No real need to hurry to connect the rooks here. Rook e8, b5. Just like in an English defence, trying to increase the scope of the fianchetted king's bishop. h5, a4, rook b8, a5, bishop h6. Note how difficult it is for the black bishop pair to find very much to be doing in this setup. Well, a lot of ways you can continue now with white. Rook b1, rook c1, queen to b3, queen to d3. All of them have the general idea of a build-up on the queen's side and trying to make something of A, the queenside spatial majority, and B, the fact that here the bishop pair in a closed position is not an advantage for black. In the game Hodgson-Davis from the Watson-Farley-Williams tournaments of May 1991, Hodgson actually preferred the immediate knight d5. Interesting treatment. After knight takes knight, took back with a c-pawn. And the idea is that the black c-pawn is now back on an open file, whilst, as per usual, his bishops aren't doing very much. In the event, Hodgson was to slowly squeeze black to death here. Bishop d7, queen b3, h4, only now did he castle belatedly. Black's position here may be defensible, doesn't have that many weaknesses apart from c7, but it certainly isn't much fun to play. The diagrammed position represents a further example of this plan in operation. Here white has castled reasonably early on, and black has chosen to play the move c6. Therefore we can't drop a knight on d5, but we can continue the queenside build-up. Queen d3, bishop d7, a4. You'll note that whilst white has a very simple natural plan of increasing space on the queen's side, there is no natural plan for black here. Tried a5, white pressed on with b5, queen c7, rook b1. Bishop f8, rather a sad looking move, an indication of how little scope the bishops have in this position. White just carries on with his build-up, very simple to follow. Rook b3, rook e to c8, queen to b1. Very interesting plan to increase pressure on the b7 square. Rook a to b8, queen b2. Well, at this point, rather than sit and wait for the other rook to come over to b1 and for the b file to be opened with clear advantage to white, black played c5. And white gained the advantage with the aid of some very elegant tactical strokes. He played b6, queen d8 is forced, knight to b5, threatening to win the exchange with knight to a7. So black took on b6, and white now took on c5, and the point is that recapturing with the pawn is forced because the knight on f6 is attacked by the queen on b2. So pawn takes pawn, and then rook d1. Now white threatens knight to d6, winning the exchange. What's black to do? The only real way to avoid it for the time being is to play the queen back to d8, but this is terribly passive and walking into an awesome pin down the d file. In the event, the player of the black piece is Novik. We're following the game Alexandrov Novik from Moscow 1991, preferred to play bishop g7 and give up the material, but after knight d6, queen c7, white just took it and went on to realise his advantage. He still of course has a very nice structure as well in a further 20 moves. So I think both these games, Hodgson-Davis and Alexandrov Novik, give an example of how simple this plan is to follow and how effective it can be in practice. To c7 to c5 is one of the sharper replies to the Trompovsky. Black hits back at the centre immediately. Now, play essentially subdivides here into two variations. The move bishop takes f6 has been quite popular. The idea being that after black takes back with the g-pawn, you then go d5 and reply to queen b6 with queen c1. Now queen b6 is a move very, very often seen in the Trompovsky in association with an early c5. In my opinion, this position offers black at least equal chances, and therefore I'm not going to concentrate too much upon 3 bishop takes f6. Instead, I want to look at the move 3d5. Now, there are 2 main lines of play here. First of all, knight to e4, which will lead us back into variations I shall be looking at by transposition in the section on 2 knight to e4. So for the time being, I'm going to leave that reputable move alone. The other main line here is to bring the queen out, as mentioned, with queen b6, attacking the b2 pawn. Before we look at that, there's a few other moves to be mentioned. b7 to b5 is hardly ever played in this position. I'm not sure why not. It's a perfectly good move with associations with Benoni or Blumenfeld structures. After knight to f3, we would have transposed to a form of the Benoni stroke Blumenfeld. Also, c4 would lead us back into a sub-variation of the Benko gambit, which I wouldn't recommend for white. And of course, taking on f6 is also perfectly playable. After 3d6, I would recommend 4 knight c3, to be followed with a rapid e4, leading us back into a form of the Pietz defence. Indeed, the fianchetto of the king's bishop is really the only consequent development here for black, so after g6, e4, bishop g7. My own preference would be for queen d2, systems for white involving a rapid advance on the king's side, should black castle over there, as he almost certainly will. For example, after castles, perhaps bishop e2, with a rapid h4, h5 in mind, or even the immediate h4. If something quieter is to your taste, then knight f3 is a bit more sedate. The move 3d6, as we've seen, is quite well suited to angling play back into a Pietz or King's Indian formation. 3e6, however, probably doesn't work quite so well here. After the reply knight c3, black is not well placed. Taking on d5 will just lead to an inferior pawn structure for him, without much active piece play to compensate him for it. And g6 is running into immediate problems in view of moves like knight to e4 or e4. 3 queen to b6 is the most aggressive and consequent move, trying to exploit the absence of the bishop from c1. Well, it can return there now, an amazing move. It's actually been seen in some master games, which we're certainly not going to spend much time on. Knight c3 is my recommendation, and there's only really one consistent move for black, which is to take the b2 pawn, and after which there's only really one consistent move for white, which is to retreat his bishop to d2. And the idea is he will now gain considerable time and development lead and get a central pawn roller as compensation for the b2 pawn. This is really known as the Vaganyan gambit, after Raphael Vaganyan of Armenia, who pioneered it principally in the 1970s. It's not 100% clear. Black may be able to get away with this, but there aren't many people who like to go in for this when playing black. So after queen b6, e4. Now d6 is consequent to prevent the knight being kicked away. Well, surely the most consistent move now is f2 to f4 to build up a pawn centre, and has been seen in the overwhelming majority of cases. In a recent Yugoslav game from 1992, knight f3 was produced between Levitina and Bojkovic. After g6, white shows a very placid build-up indeed. h3, bishop g7, bishop c4, and went on in fact to hold the draw. But this seems to be completely inconsistent with the whole idea of the gambit. We want to mass in the centre and make the most of our development lead as soon as we can. So 7f4 is the logical move. The first time this gambit appeared was in a game between Vaganyan and Koprechik in 1974. Koprechik is a brilliant tactician, but even he got rolled away quite quickly by this dangerous idea. The game continued g6, seems logical enough, to fianchetto, e5, and now Koprechik took on e5. Certainly not as good a move as retreating the knight to d7. White took back, knight d7, Knight f3, bishop g7, rook b1, useful gain of time on that queen. Queen to base, and the move e6. Playing as sharply as possible. Led to a sparkling miniature victory for white. F takes e6, knight g5, knight to f6 to avoid some horrible happening on the e6 square. Bishop to b5 check, and if any minor piece goes in the way, then knight takes a6 is winning immediately. So king f8. And now pawn takes on e6. It looks as though the white initiative has run out of steam after a6. But Vaganyan played quite brilliantly to keep it going. He played the move bishop to e3 here. And the point is that if black exchanges queens, after the white recapture, mate is threatened on d8, and black has no satisfactory way of coping with that. So instead, Vaganyan played his queen to a5, but Vaganyan kept the kettle boiling, tempo of the attack raging, by castling. Several white pieces on prise, we can demonstrate they can't really be taken there. If queen takes c3, simply queen d8 check, checkmate. The refutation of a takes b5 is a bit more complex. White takes back with the rook, exploiting the fact that the black queen must cover the back rank for the time being to prevent queen d8 checkmate, so clearly queen c7 is therefore forced. And after knight d5, all the white pieces are cooperating in an attack on the somewhat exposed black king, and they're gaining time for their activities by booting the black queen about. Quite a lot of variations here, but for example, if queen e5, white can play bishop takes c5, with a picturesque lineup of 4 of his pieces on the 5th rank, all combining an attack against the black king. If now queen takes g5, then bishop takes e7 check, followed by a move of the knight from d5, is going to win the black queen, under very pleasant circumstances for white. And if, for example, now knight to c6, white could even start to look at moves like knight takes e7 as a way of continuing the attack. All these variations very attractive, tremendous violence on the board, an indication of just how correct Vaganyan's sacrifice and initiative have been. Trompovsky actually played 17h6. This didn't help matters very much. After queen d3, he got marmalised in very short order. King to g8. Doesn't make much difference what black does now. Queen takes g6, threatening mate. Bishop takes on e6. Got smartly captured. Rook h7. Well, all roads lead to Rome now, but Vaganyan chose to play rook takes f6. Knight d7 instead of resigning. Bishop takes d7, and now he resigned. So a blistering smash for the Vaganyan gambit on its first appearance. But there are better defences for black, as we shall see. Here's a sturdier defence, 7g6, e5, and in preference to Trompovsky's capture, knight from f6 to d7. Knight f3, and some accuracy is called for here from black. In a game between Vaganyan and Jansa from 1974, Jansa played bishop g7, after rook b1, with queen on d8, whereupon white developed something of an initiative with once again e6, f takes e6, knight g5, knight f8, a disruptive move bishop to b5 check, d7 of course, d takes e6, bishop takes on b5, and knight takes on b5, where white has quite a lot of compensation for the pawn because of his intrusive knights, particularly the f7 square, and the pawn e6 is a real wedge in black's throat. 6 times US champion Walter Brown took note of those events and preferred the move 9a6 in his game with Miguel Quinteros from Lone Pine tournament of 1975. Looks rather a cryptic move. We see the point though is to keep pieces out of b5 and e6. So Miguel built up his centre, bishop c4, bishop g7, queen e2, castles. At this point he chose to ram forward with e6. Maybe the move a4 was to be considered here, to suppress a subsequent b5 from black after his queen has moved away. Anyway, after e6, events quickly came to a head. F takes e6, knight g5, familiar device. Knight f6, knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, queen takes e6 check. Here it's clear that white has a certain compensation for his pawn in terms of his initiative and development lead. If, for example, king h8, you could choose between, well, rook b1, gain a tempo, drive the queen back, queen c7, a4, the positional move, with a certain bind for the pawn. Or, if you're feeling in more of a caveman mood, if we go back to after king h8, the advance of the h-pawn might catch your eye with ideas of h5 and various sacrificial attacking possibilities against the black king. I think this is where I prefer to play, going for mate rather than play positionally. And if rook f7, the move f5 to open up the b1 to h7 diagonal for the white king bishop is going to give a very nice initiative indeed for this gambited pawn. One of the best ways of figuring out good counters to opening ideas is to see what their inventors themselves had to say about them. Vaganyan's suggested counter to his gambit was e7 to e6, nibbling away at the white centre immediately. There have been very few theoretical examples indeed of this position. One idea might be to try to induce black to capture on e6 with a pawn rather than with a piece, so for example bishop b5 check, trying to be somewhat disruptive. And if knight d7, then to take on e6 and to play bishop c4, which might force black to play knight b8 in order to cover the e6 square. If he went e5, he's really opening himself up on the light squares to our delight from the white point of view after knight f3, with a very healthy initiative. Upon the interpolation with the bishop, the interesting idea of pawn takes e6 occurs to me. The point being that if black plays bishop takes b5, white is only temporarily a piece down, he can now take on f7 with check, and after the recapture, regain his bishop with rook b1, meeting a6 of course with a4. He's likely to have the better chances in view of the disturbance of the black king's cover. Alternatively, if black takes back with the f-pawn, then I think after bishop c4, the white bishop is quite usefully deployed in the struggle against the black centre. Black has an extra pawn, but white has useful attacking chances. In particular, the position of the bishop on c4 makes it harder for black to castle kingside because of the pawn lever f4, f5, or even a knight coming into g5, with irritation to the black centre. So, for example, after knight c6, knight f3, now bishop e7, well, the immediate e5 is to be considered as quite a disruptive move, as indeed it also comes into consideration should black castle queenside in this position. There's a lot of scope for experimentation here, but I would prefer this particular method of continuing with the Vaganyan gambit against 7e6. You may have noted that many of the games we considered in the Vaganyan gambit were from the 1970s. I think the explanation for this is not due to any refutation of the gambit per se, but that after 2c5, the move 3d5 fell into disuse because people preferred to play bishop takes f6. And after the recapture, g takes f6, then d5, meeting queen b6 with queen c1. This is, as you can see, quite a different treatment. White is aiming for some sort of structural advantage. Not entirely clear he's going to get it. The gambit has never, as I say, been refuted, and in my opinion it's a perfectly good alternative to this positional treatment, and I'd recommend it. 2d5 is a surprisingly rarely seen reply to the Trompovsky. Perfectly playable. The survey looks purely at the capture on f6 now for white. Moves like knight c3 or knight f3 take play back into recognised systems, the Verisov system after knight c3, or the Torre attack after knight f3. There's something else. we are capturing here. Black, you may observe, has two moves. The first one I want to examine is taken back with the g-pawn. It is a move I actually played myself on one occasion in a Grandmaster tournament against a familiar name, Julian Hodgson. I just want to take you through the first few moves of that game to illustrate certain themes and ideas. He played c4, and I chose, rather than to erect a pawn centre, to try to liquidate the centre of pawns, hoping that the resulting position would lead to favourable play for my bishops. e3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, pawn takes pawn, white recaptured, and bishop g7. This is a sort of middle game structure I had in mind. Knight c3, castles. But this position is already quite critical for the assessment of this variation. White played the natural knight f3, but I think this move is actually quite a serious inaccuracy. After the natural bishop g4, castles, knight c6, clearly he's got to think of a way of dealing with the pressure on the d-pawn. d5 was played, knight to e5, bishop e2, I took, and I went f5. This is really the end of the theoretical discussion of that game. Black has a very, very easy to play position here. It's true the pawn structure around his king has been slightly disturbed, but that doesn't matter so much. In conjunction with the bishop on g7, the knight coming into c4 most likely, and the open use of the c-file, give a very, very comfortable game indeed. In fact, I went on to win in about 35 moves. White should have preferred 9 knight e2 to 9 knight f3. By so doing, he avoids the possibility of the annoying simplification we just saw, and in the subsequent middle games he could well be able to use his isolated d-pawn as a dynamic asset, rather than the lifeless impediment to his bishop on f3, which we just saw. So, for example, after knight c6, queen d2, preparing a build-up with rook d1. In this middle game that's about to arise, another very prominent feature to bear in mind is the possibility of the white knight hopping in, after subsequent build-up moves of course, to g3 to h5, where it could be a considerable irritant to the black king side. This is a far more dynamic treatment than the rather lackluster knight f3 Hodgson chose, and it's the way I'd recommend for white. The recapture with the e-pawn is probably more commonly seen. And after e3, black has a solid enough setup, which white is going to chisel away at in probably one of two ways. He's either going to play for c2, c4, eventually, or straight away, or he's going to play, certainly after some preparation, for e3 to e4. So, for example, bishop d6, c4, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, castles. Black has given away his strong point in the centre, but he has a nice bishop pair. The last time I saw this position, or something very similar to it, was in round 1 of the British Championship of 1989, where I managed to win in 113 moves against rather determined resistance. Here's rather a quicker success, this time from the man who became British champion in the early 1990s. Once again, Mr. J. Hodgson. Knight c3, a6, rather a cryptic move. Like he's trying to set up the advanced c5 on the queen side. Rook to c1, played Hodgson. I was playing in this tournament. At this point I was walking around and I bumped into Julian and I said to him, "It seems rather an insipid opening you've played there." And he said, "Well, it can be, but there is actually a trick in this position." And since you're not supposed to discuss games in depth, I didn't ask him what he was referring to. But I was soon to see, because in fact black played a blunder, c5, which white took. Now the caption is white to play and win. Bishop takes f7 check is the answer. Rook takes is impossible because the queen takes queen, and if king takes, then queen h5 check. As was actually played, king g8, Queen takes c5. White was a good pawn up and went on to win in 31 moves. There are quite a few different moves black can choose from here apart from bishop d6. For example, if c6, we can consider some of the structures white can adopt to play for the other advance I mentioned, the other plan, e4. Bishop d3, unlikely to find a better square than that. Queen b6, disruptive move. b3, bishop e6. Now the queen comes out to f3 and both of the knights are dropped to d2 and e2. Quite a familiar plan. Knight to e2. What we envisage doing here with white is to follow up with knight d2, probably c3, and to break with e4, leading to a slight advantage, most likely, in a very solid setting. This is the other one of the two great plans, two natural plans, inherent in the structure of the position. Here's an example of that setup in action. Bishop d3, bishop d6, that comes the queen to f3. Black castling kingside, the knight out. Black fiddles around with queen b6, we take time out to protect our rook. a5. And we could react to the advance of this irksome a-pawn in one of two ways. We're playing a3, which would be my own personal preference, to follow up with knight d2. In the game between Hort and Tukmarkov from Madrid in 1973, two strong grandmasters of course, c3 was played. And after bishop to e6, knight to d2, knight d7, white castled, queen c7. Hort assessed the position as equal. For myself, I think I'd prefer to play white here. The black bishops have no scope at all. The attempt to mobilize them based upon the advance c7, or c6 in this position, c5, would lead to the certain isolation of the pawn at d5, which would be a real weakness in the following middle game. And so, for example, if we cope here with the threat to our h-pawn, for example, h3, we have at our disposal, as I've been discussing, the advance c3 to e4 later on with a slight structural superiority, and the other plan is still up our sleeve of advancing the c-pawn, try to gain space on that side of the board if we prefer as well. But this setup, bishop d3, queen f3, e3, knight d2, knight e2, is one very much to bear in mind. It is probably the key to how to handle this situation after black takes back with the e-pawn. 2e6 is perhaps the most classical reply of all to the Trompovsky. Black doesn't concern himself with early attempts at grabbing the initiative, just a logical developing move, avoiding the doubling of his f-pawns. The move I'm going to concentrate upon is the reply 3e4, whereby white will seize the centre, but at the cost, after 3h6, of the pair of bishops. It's not the only move. 3 knight f3 transposes to the Torre attack, a perfectly viable but quite distinct opening system. And 3c4 is to be noted. I believe that's Michael Steen's idea originally, used with success by Serawan, for example, to beat Nigel Short in 1982 in the London tournament. It was played against me by the ex-British champion Brian Ely on one occasion. So, 3e4, h6, of course white must exchange, and we are faced with what is essentially the starting position for the 2e6 variation. For the time being, the black pair of bishops aren't making themselves felt. White has the pawn centre. Well, the great preference with white has been to play knight f3, and the overwhelming majority of those defending the black pieces have chosen to play a fianchetto. d6 is a consequent move, putting the pawns on dance squares. One of the earliest games in this variation was between Korchnoi and Karpov from their candidates final of 1974, where white played knight c3. Turned out in fact to be, in reality, a match for the World Championship, since Fischer was stripped of his title, for very strange reasons, by FIDE. So knight c3, g6, queen d2, and queen e7. It's a very noteworthy strategy here by Karpov. He just waited events whilst developing his bishop pair, his minor pieces, and keeping an eye on the dart squares. White castled, a6, h4. Noteworthy move, just fixing some territory. Bishop into fianchetto, g3, and now b5. Of course, I played bishop h3. And here Karpov played what's for him quite an uncharacteristically pushy move in the opening. He advanced with b4, after which the game burst into flames, following knight d5. E takes d5. Bishop takes c8. In fact, an unclear middle game arose and Korchnoi won a very long game indeed. If we go back to the position before, b4, and substitute for it knight d7, we're left with rather an unclear position, where neither side has an obvious strategy for continuing. There are no real weaknesses in either camp, and chances are somewhat balanced. A lot of people playing black here have the natural plan of trying to do something, take control of the dark squares. So for example, after d6, c3, g6, knight d2, e5, knight c4, all very natural moves, easy to follow. A very consequent move is to play knight d7 to strong point on the e5 square. After knight d7, some of the themes are, for example, white can put the bishop on d3, and in a subsequent middle game we often see him holding his centre, having castled, playing his rook to e1, and then the advance a4 to a5, probing on the queen side and gaining space, is very thematic. I played Nigel Short in a tournament in 1983, and in this position he in fact rather curiously chose to take on d4. Surprised me and pleased me. I took back with a knight. He brought his bishop into fianchetto and played bishop d3. And he played another move which surprised me. He played knight c6. I took that off. Welcome to see a deterioration in his pawn structure. Obviously he was aware that his pawn structure was being doubled. I castled it. He explained to me afterwards he thought though that the activity he would gain through superior control of the centre, because of this nice pawn cluster on c6, d6, c7, and his bishop pair, would leave him with a satisfactory middle game. But in fact, after f4 here, I can see no satisfactory plan for black at all. His bishop on g7 is biting on granite vis-à-vis the pawn on c3, and there are a variety of attractive schemes for white. In the event, the game went rook b8, queen c2, queen e7, rook a e1, bishop e6, and there are lots and lots of nice ways of playing this with white now. Building up on the king's side with f5, slowly building up with rook e2. In the event, I managed to exchange off this bishop for this one, and we were left, after several exchanges, several manoeuvres rather, with this sort of structure, where the knight far outclassed the bishop, which has no scope whatsoever, as I say, and in fact I went on to win the game in about 31 moves. That was an example of black strong pointing with the bishop in fianchetto, or more noteworthily failing to hold the strong point on e5. Here's an example of black erecting that same strong point and putting the bishop on e7. After knight f3, d6, knight c3, c6, queen d2, and now e5. The significance of c6, of course, being to prevent the knight incursion on d5. White castles, so he now has a substantial development lead. 3 pieces out and castled, plus a pawn centre. Black has developed just the one piece. Bishop e7. Black's pluses are the bishop pair, and it's rather hard to get into her position. Her position, this is Sousa Polgar playing black here against Julian Hodgson from Haifa, the team tournament of 1989. King b1, a useful waiting move. Knight d7. h4, same idea we saw in the Korchnoi game. Staking out territory, a useful space gaining move, and it may have an attacking aspect to it as well. Well, at this point, Sousa didn't castle, presumably because she thought that the white development lead after bishop c4 was rather irksome. It's not too easy to play this position with black. For example, if now b5, then white probably has the trick bishop takes b5, and if c takes b5, knight d5, queen e6, Knight c7, picking up the exchange, leading to obscure complications, probably in white's favour. Of course, it's not just about one trick, the position. After bishop c4, if we go back, this is it, after bishop c4, black having castled, some storm clouds are also looming against the black king. If white can build up an attack quite quickly based upon g4 and g5. So it's all very well to talk about this pride and joy of a strong point, but there are some difficulties here from black's point of view. So if we go back, we retract the moves castles, which wasn't played, bishop c4, which wasn't played, we get the pawn exchange in the centre. E takes d4, knight takes d4. But now another feature of the position is the tactical embarrassment which may occur to the black queen on f6. King's uses knight to e5, otherwise the white knight's coming into f5, winning immediately. f4, of course, knight to g4. I'm not quite clear what this Neddy is doing on g4, hopping around there. h5 played Hodgson, a useful constructive move, gaining some space on the king's side, and there are some unpleasant tactics in the air. If now, for example, castles, white could consider the move g3. Not the only one. It has the extraordinary threat, though, of e5. Pawn takes pawn, knight e4, and it's bye-bye queen. A reference to some of those tactics I referred to earlier. I think it must have been the spectre of variations like that which caused Zsuzsa Polgar, this is the position, not to play castles but to play bishop d8, sort of a quasi-waiting move, also vacating the square e7 should the queen run into an embarrassment. But it was the king which ran into an embarrassment now, because Hodgson, ever alert to tactical possibilities, played the brilliant move knight to b5. Clearly black has only one chance. Pawn takes knight, otherwise the d-pawn falls for nothing. Bishop takes on b5 check. And we begin to see the tactical verification of this move. If king e7, of course the fork on d5 wins immediately. If king f8, then e5, and the opening of lines in the centre will be tremendously strong for white. So the lady preferred bishop d7. The refutation of this is quite simple. Bishop takes bishop check, king takes bishop, and now queen e2, an unlikely looking tactic. The point being the knight cannot move, therefore the only way to suspend loss is to take the pawn on f4. This is obviously very helpful to white from the attacking point of view after rook f1. Queen g5, rook f5. Relentless Hodgson, insisting the queen goes to the worst possible square before he continues the attack. Queen b5 check. King c8. Rook takes f7. Threatening mate on b7, and the reply to bishop c7 would be the same as the reply to the actual game move of bishop e7, which was knight d5, an immediate resignation. Very attractive miniature. Hodgson taking advantage of the full dynamic potential of his position. Move order can be quite critical in this system. For example, d6, knight c3, knight d7, queen d2, and a6, a move along the lines of the c6 move we saw earlier, designed to prevent the white knight from going where it ought not to. So castles, g6, everything going smoothly with black's development, until e5 comes along. And clearly black can't take this pawn because of mate d8 at the end of it. So after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen e7, he would like to calmly complete development, but by playing vigorously, white can thwart that. Knight e4, bishop g7, queen c3, and the defense of the c7 pawn is a real embarrassment. This position has actually occurred a couple of times in Grandmaster practice. Once again, Julian Hodgson playing white against Chris Ward, candidate Grandmaster, in a tournament in London in 1988. Ward chose knight b6, but after knight f6 check, felt obliged to forfeit castling rights with king f8. After bishop e2, Clearly simple development from white is going to leave black in a very, very bad way indeed. So Ward tried bishop d7, but after queen takes c7, he had no real compensation for the pawn and lost. The position after 12 queen c3 also occurred in a game between two Latvian masters, Malyutin and Shekachev. Try saying that late at night. And Shekachev tried to solve the problems by playing f5, but obviously this is going to seriously compromise the black pawn structure. And after e takes f6 en passant, knight takes f6, knight takes f6 check, bishop takes f6, knight to e5, black's structural difficulties were too much, and he lost the game in just 25 moves. I noted the significance of the move a7 to a6 in the previous line. Here's an example of what can happen to you if you don't play it at the right moment. Knight d7, white played the, to my mind, rather inferior move bishop d3. I think he should be playing queen d2 and casting as fast as possible, in fact. g6, queen d2, bishop g7. Question mark. Why? Here's why. Knight b5. Queen d8. Queen to c3. What to do? The only move is knight c5. It's obviously not the sort of move you want to play. And after e5, taking on d3 with check does not solve black's problems. White simply takes back with the pawn. So he was forced to play knight a6 in a game Rosenthalis versus Razovayev from the German Bundesliga in 1991. But after simply castles, white began the normal kingside offensive with h4, and the, to say the least, strange positioning of that knight on a6 told against black in the subsequent complications after, for example, bishop d7, h5, g5, knight to h2, and the game subsequently opened up on the kingside, and black was made to suffer for the strange knight positioning. So that's why a6 is necessary. In this system, my own personal preference is definitely for the lines where white plays knight c3, queen d2, and rapidly castles queenside. As we have seen, the plan involving c3, and perhaps the advance a4 to a5, is another more sedate method. Here's another example of black not getting his defences set up correctly against this queen d2 castles queenside system, and rapidly going under. Knight c6. Looks an innocent enough move. Queen d2, bishop d7, both sides hasten to castle. So at least this time round, black has matched white for developing moves. But after d5, once again there are some problems in him getting his act together. Candidate Grandmaster James Howell preferred knight e7 in this position in a game from the British Championship of 1991, but he became yet another Hodgson victim after queen e3. King b8, e5. A very simple, very elegant and extremely effective method of demonstrating white's superiority in mobilization and space. There really isn't any clear route to equality here for black. If pawn takes on e5, then accurate sequence of taking on e6, and black can't take back with the bishop, obviously. Taking with the pawn is positional suicide, but after queen takes, there are once again some embarrassing problems for black in completing his development after knight takes e5. To conclude this look at 2e6, there was an interesting novelty produced by black in yet another Hodgson game, this time also against Chris Ward from the 1991 British Championships. After c5, flummoxed by this new entity, Hodgson played e5, and his own opinion was that after h6, white had in fact no advantage. The best he could produce was bishop c1. Then went knight d5, c4, knight b6, white took. Black recaptured. White went knight f3. In fact went on to win, but Grandmaster Hodgson thought not because of the consequences of the opening. By analogy with the Vaganyan gambit we saw earlier, perhaps white's best try here is to play d5, to meet queen b6 with knight c3, queen takes b2, and now either the retreat bishop d2, or in this instance he also has the interesting possibility, maybe better, of knight to e2, getting developed. It's a gambit, but obviously there are a lot of attacking chances, and an initiative white in return for the pawn. Certainly the most common reply to the Trompovsky is 2 knight e4. Now it used to be, if we go back 15 or 20 years, that the virtual main line of this opening was the retreat 3 bishop to h4, and then black advancing with either g5 immediately, or after c5, on his next move, g5, let's say after d5. Well, I used to be a player of bishop h4 myself. What really turned me off it was some developments in the 1980s, specifically by a group of young English masters, including Hodgson, Gallagher, Jacobs and others. These chaps used to play a lot of tournaments in Spain, and a great deal of investigation on the position after bishop h4, g5, f3, capturing the bishop, capturing the knight, took place. In their games, and games they played against other people, from both colours. And what eventually transpired was a consensus which they communicated to me, which I agreed with, that black was probably better here with one of two moves. Either the old traditional move, c7 to c5, or, at first sight, a very strange looking concept indeed, and a move they really did play a great deal in Spain, e5. It's this move in particular which I feel defangs the bishop h4 variation of the Trompovsky. Grandmaster Rainer Knark of Germany employed the move 5e5 in a game from the 1991 German Bundesliga. This is what he did to his opponent, Mr. Keitlinghaus, after knight f3, e takes d4. The whole concept is black couldn't care less about the pawn structure. He just wants to get very active on the dark squares. Queen x d4, rook g8. The whole variation with f3 and g5 was once described by William Harston as a form of Chinese king's gambit. Certainly it's a very strange structure indeed that arrives. After queen e5 check, queen e7, Knark shows his willingness to give up at least one pawn. After queen takes c7, he carried on in admirably energetic fashion. Knight a6, queen c4, b5. The idea obviously being that if queen takes b5, rook b8, and black activity is breaking out all over. So queen d5 was preferred. Knight c7, queen d3, bishop to b7. Extremely energetic performance here from black. The sort of dynamism the black game contains here is, I think, indicative of the sort of middle games we get after 5e5, and shows you why experienced Trompovsky exponents like grandmasters Hodgson and Gallagher, and myself included, I dare say, were moved to turn away from the move 3 bishop h4 for white. In passing, I should also note that the attempt 5 c5, which leads to quite different middle games, is also, in my opinion, favourable for black. That's why the sort of position you see here is not one we recommend white to steer for in this survey. So people fell away from the idea of putting the bishop on h4, but the seductive lure of that square was not to be denied, and so the move pawn to h4 became the focus of attention. Now I've actually written of this move that it is an absurdity, and if it actually leads to an advantage for white, then I'm going to give up chess. Bit over the top, but you can see what I'm getting at. Black, certainly with a tempo less, could never possibly get away with an idea like this. Maybe white can just pull it off. Clearly any sort of normal development from black is likely to lead to a sensible middle game for him. But in the most diverse of settings, somehow the advance of this h-pawn can turn out to have a relevance. If, for example, black captures on g5 at some point in the future, the h-file can become open, and that can be a relevant factor in some of the very complicated middle games that arise. I cannot possibly recommend the bizarre h4 other than as a purely psychological device. For example, a couple of methods by which black should be able to equalise quite straightforwardly are c5, and if d5 to play ordinary Benoni moves such as g6 to commence a fianchetto, or if white takes on c5, knight to a6, preparing to capture that c-pawn, After knight d2, knight from a6 takes c5. After knight f3, there are no weaknesses at all in the black position, and we have this funny move h4 to take account of. Queen b6 is a very simple method here of achieving perhaps slightly more than equality with black. Another simple idea is to play d5, and following knight d2, not to take the bishop on g5, after which the cryptic h4 comes into some significance. After h takes g5, the opening of the h-file may actually mean something for white. In preference, black should do what Mayachi Gobenidze did against me upon one of the few occasions I was mad enough to play h4. Took on d2, took back with the queen and played c5. If white now captures on c5, then after f6, which was actually the course of my game with Gobenidze, he has really no sensible retreat for the bishop, because e7 to e5 just follows very naturally and very powerfully for black afterwards. And if he chooses to support the centre somehow, with either c2 to c3 or e2 to e3, then just natural developing moves give black a troubleless middle game. For example, bringing the knight out to c6, or the queen out to b6, or even the exchange. In all instances we have a placid middle game shaping up, with the white h-pawn having ripped loose from its moorings. I think white's best move here is to put the bishop back to f4, whereupon the overwhelmingly popular moves now are either d7 to d5 or c7 to c5. In a recent game, ex-world title contender David Bronstein played a new move here against me. He played e6. And after my reply f3, knight f6, e4, and I was rather expecting d5 with some comparisons to a French defence, but in fact played c5. I went c3, and he just played bishop to e7. A form of development I can find no previous example of. My strategy was just to build up around the centre. I went queen d2, he castled, and I followed up with bishop d3 and knight e2. White slightly more comfortable because of his spatial superiority in the centre, and in fact I went on to win. 2d5, very sensible. And white has essentially two plans: to play a simple but rather uninspiring move like knight d2, after which he is probably very slightly better, or to play for the pawn advance e4, prefacing it of course with f3, knight back to f6. Now you might think, if you think like me, that knight c3 is necessary here to set up e4, but in fact e4 has been played by very strong players like Yugoslav Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov. The point being that after d takes e4, knight c3, white is a tempo up on a Blackmar-Diemer gambit. You don't see the Blackmar-Diemer gambit very often these days because it's not a very good opening. With an extra tempo, it is really worth considering. After, for example, e takes f3, knight takes f3. It's up to you if you feel like giving a pawn like that. Personally, I don't. Mikhail Gurevich is a world-class grandmaster. He's an adherent of 4 knight d2. Here's a recent game of his from the French League in 1991. Black dropped back to f6, e3, g6, c4, and we have some hybrid form of the Grunenfeld defence materialising before us. Knight e2, castles, knight c3, c6, bishop e2. Obviously, there are many, many different setups black could adopt, but this is an example of the sort of small advantage you might get from knight d2 if black tries to play in Grunenfeld defence. The most solid and popular reply is to take on d2 immediately. And after white's recapture, to put the bishop outside the pawn chain with bishop f5. Knight f3, e6. Now obviously such positions are not all that lively, but the advantage will be with white, if with anyone, because he is one tempo ahead in development. Naturally he's going to follow up with e3, c4, and some queenside play. 3c5 is one of the sharpest and also one of the most reputable ways of handling the Trompovsky with black. I'm looking purely at the move 4d5 here for white. It's the most consequent and logical move. Now, black, on the great majority of occasions, has played queen to b6 when this position has arisen. Not the only move. For example, queen a5 check. Could be met with knight d2. And after e6 then, for example, c3. And if pawn takes pawn, white can regain the pawn by now playing queen d5, leading to interesting and uncharted positions. 3e6 is another relative rarity, but a well-motivated move, striking back at the centre. My own personal preference now will be for something like c4, maintaining that pawn, or f3, intending to support it with e4 in a moment. In a game from the Manila Interzonal, 1992, perhaps the world's leading exponent of the Trompovsky, Michael Adams took on e6. After the recapture, f takes e6. Continued developing quietly with e3. Andras Adorian is a very, very dangerous tactician. He played queen f6, c3, bishop d6. Catching on d6 now is not best. Adams preferred knight d2, and the play became rich and strange. Knight takes d2, bishop takes d6, knight takes f1, king takes f1, b6, and that's a very unusual middle game developed, in which Adams was able to demonstrate that this bishop on d6 is so much of a pain that white is probably better here. For queen to b6, and immediately there is a parting of the ways. Black threatens to win the b2 pawn, white can decide either to defend it or to gambit it. Well, the gambit continuation 5 knight d2 has been becoming increasingly popular of late, though the theoretical conclusions on it still aren't entirely certain. Black can win the pawn in two ways. He can take on b2 immediately, the point being that after knight takes e4, he regains his piece with queen b4 check. Alternatively, he can just take on d2 immediately, and the correct recapture is with the bishop. And after queen takes b2, e4. Well, by analogy with the Wagner gambit we saw earlier on, you understand the nature of white's compensation here. Black is going to lose some time getting his queen back in the game. White has a central majority and a development lead. Black has a pawn, and there are certain people who are more interested in grabbing the pawn than taking into account the other, to their minds, slightly more esoteric considerations I've just drawn out for you. That's the reason why players like Mark Hebden have taken this pawn in the past. If you look in the appended booklet, you'll see a game of mine against him, which I managed to demonstrate the white attack is quite useful, if black isn't very careful indeed. In a training game played in late 1992, a blitz training tournament between myself, Daniel King, Michael Adams and William Watson, this position occurred. And Watson's continuation was as follows. I was white, he went g6, I played rook b1. And the first point is black can't take the a-pawn, because after bishop c3 there are two threats to take the rook and rook a1 trapping the queen. Therefore, the queen retreats to f6. Now, obviously a 5-minute game isn't the most difficult theoretical test of any line in the world, but the ideas inherent in the variation are shown out by it. I went rook b3, setting up bishop c3 of course. William went e5 to try and permanently block the diagonal. f4, get some lines open. E takes f4, a very cheeky move. The point being to meet bishop c3 with queen to h4 check. So instead of that I played knight to f3. Watson played bishop g7. Clearly he was perfectly happy to meet bishop c3 now with queen takes bishop check, with plenty of material for his sacrificed queen. On e5, queen e7, bishop takes f4. And this is what you want when you gambit. Lots of open play and a development lead. And the game concluded d6, bishop check, bishop d7, castles, pawn takes pawn, d6, queen d8, bishop g5, coming into e7, keep the black king firmly in the centre, f6. The sacrificial themes aren't too hard to find when you have this much lead in development. Knight takes e5, castles, queen d5 check, king h8, knight takes g6, black resigned because of pawn takes knight, bishop takes d7, and rook h3 check with a decisive attack for white. So that's the sort of danger inherent in this gambit. You see, it's not to be dismissed lightly at all. In this line, after 5 knight d2, knight takes d2, recapture with the bishop. The Icelandic board 1 and interzonal winner in 1987, Johan Hjartarson, declined to take the pawn when I offered it to him in round 1 of the Reykjavik tournament in 1992. Instead he thought for a while and produced e5, which is, to the best of my knowledge, a theoretical novelty. And I think what actually happened to Hjartarson here was something of a falling between two stools. He's a very classical player with an excellent strategical knowledge of chess, and he started off playing this sharp line with knight e4, c5, queen b6. And then when the b-pawn was proffered to him, perhaps in a manner he hadn't seen before, he seemed to wish to steer the game back into quieter, more classical waters. But it's a question of he who says A must say B. When you put your queen out to b6, it's usually a good idea to follow through. What actually happened was that after e4, he went d6, still declining the b2 pawn. There was no clear refutation of black taking it, either here or on the next 3 moves. White will simply gain, as classical compensation, the fact that white is slightly up in development and the black queen a bit out of play. But a pawn is a pawn, as we all know. I went bishop to d3, knight to d7, knight e2, g6, c4. And it's the last chance now for black to take the b2 pawn, which is really the only consequent move for him. As I say, he tried to keep the game under control with bishop g7, but after my move queen c2, what we now have before us is a form of the King's Indian defence, that sort of structure, where black has difficulty achieving his natural and indeed necessary advance f7 to f5. What actually happened was that after a lot of machinations, he eventually got that move in, but unfortunately it tactically immediately failed when he did play it. An even more critical gambit is after black takes on move 5, queen takes b2. White has to take on e4. Black must get his piece back. Queen b4 check. Queen d2, queen takes e4. One of the earliest theoretical references to this I can find is a game from an open in Benelux in 1988 between Kerkmeester and Jolles, which went as follows: e3, which I think is the correct move here, e6, and white chose to capture on e6, and black to take back with the f-pawn. It's difficult to give anything other than generalities as comments here because there are obviously so many different setups each side can adopt. Really, white's just trying to make as much as he can of his development lead and to make hay while the sun shines. He went knight f3, queen g6, looks a bit strange, bishop d3 to gain a tempo. I'm certainly not worried about queen takes g2. We just play king e2 to connect our rooks and keep going with a big initiative. Queen f6 played black, castles, knight to c6. And white went off with knight g5 at this point. This could be a legitimate gambit. There are an awful lot of complications. Merry mayhem broke out, and in the event white was to win this game, I refer you to the accompanying booklet. I think we'll end our theoretical consideration of it at this point. Something to bear in mind. After e6, to take on e6 as white. The position after e6 arose again in a game between two high-class grandmasters, Julian Hodgson and Murray Chandler, at the Hastings tournament of 1901 to 92. And Hodgson chose to support the pawn with c4. Chandler took a look around and was probably feeling a bit anxious that his queen might be running out of comfortable squares, so he played e5. Seems something of a loss of time to play e6 and e5. f3, played Hodgson. Obviously queen f5 is forced. And unfortunately White's next move was not the best he ever played. He went bishop d3. And after queen to f6 he could have resigned immediately, because after bishop g3, e4 attacks two white pieces. But notwithstanding that sorry event, Hodgson was to tell me that in this position, instead of bishop d3, he felt that after bishop g3 he had quite a lot of compensation for this pawn. He's going to follow up with bishop d3, rook b1, knight e2, and maybe leave the position open with f4. And he felt that he had reasonable counter chances for this gambited pawn. In a game from the London League of 1992, Black chose the move d7 to d6. One of the simplest, setting about the process of consolidation and development and challenging White to show he has enough for the gambited pawn. In this instance I was the player of the white pieces, and my opponent was the FIDE master Andrew Kinsman. And play continued f3, queen to b4, c3, queen a5, rook b1, g6, bishop d3, bishop g7, knight e2, castles. How is White to seek his compensation? I looked at ideas involving e4 and the bishop out to h6, conjunction with h4, h5, but they seemed much too slow. Eventually I came up with the idea of bishop to g5. Kinsman, somewhat to my surprise, protected the pawn by bringing his queen back home. I think his idea was to avoid any sort of weaknesses. I castled, played knight to d7. Now I found the plan of f4, the idea being to use this pawn as a spearhead to disrupt the foundations of the black king's position. I'm not entirely certain how to assess this position. In the event I went on to develop a strong attack. White has various ideas at his disposal, for example to follow up with c4 and queen c2, and a general advance of his central pawns, or, rather more exotically, perhaps knight g3, and to fish around with e4 and f5 ideas. Scope for experimentation. Certainly the biggest outing this gambit has ever received, and one of the biggest games of the whole year of 1992, was between Michael Adams and Boris Gelfand in the final of the Tilburg tournament. This position occurred. Adams in fact preferred knight f3 to e3, and Boris continued along similar lines to Andrew Kinsman. He just wanted to consolidate his pawn. d6, e3, queen b4, heading off home. c3, queen a5, rook b1, and once again the fianchetto of the king's bishop looks the most natural and strongest. What is White to do? Well, Adams came up with this idea, e4, bishop g7, e5, and managed to demonstrate in a subsequently complicated middle game that White had just enough play for his gambited pawn. But if you, unlike Michael Adams, are not the greatest talent British chess has ever produced, you may have some difficulty in justifying that. My own personal opinion is that knight f3 is an inferior move to Hodgson's e3. The line with 2 knight e4 is one of the most popular and important in the whole Trompovsky. In a rational universe where God does not play dice with it, I find it hard to believe that the move 3h4 is really credible from White's point of view, even if Julian Hodgson does beat Michael Adams with it in the Viscount Grandmaster tournament. The move 3 bishop to h4 was quite popular in the 70s and 80s, but after g5, f3, pawn takes h4, f takes e4, I believe the move e5, pioneered by some British masters, is going to be the one which leaves this variation in the theoretical books as always favourable to black. 3 bishop to f4 is a move with quite a strong following amongst the grandmasters of the world. The critical line arises after c5, d5, queen to b6. Well, irrespective of the objective merits of the gambit I recommended with knight d2 here, and you've seen it played by some of the world's strongest players in some of the world's most important games, the alternatives do not look entirely inspiring. To retreat with bishop to c1 is not the most natural of moves, and after something like e6, black is doing very well indeed. Julian Hodgson did actually beat me with the move queen c1 in the 1991 British Championships. I continued with g6, f3, bishop to g7. But if we go back to after queen c1, the simple move e6 is likely to leave black at least equal already at move 5, for white has little alternative but to already capture on e6, and all recaptures are quite nice for black, the best one being with, of course, the f-pawn. So, by process of elimination, we arrive at this gambit with knight d2. I can't swear to its actual objective merits, but at the moment there's no clear refutation of it, and it's certainly good fun.
I hope this survey illustrates that there are still many relatively unexplored ideas within the Trompovsky, and I would recommend it as an interesting, dangerous and foxy opening.